Hi everyone, it's Dr. Claire Ashley here. Today what I want to talk about is it burnout? Now this is a question that I get asked a lot, where people come to me either on social media through my DMs, or when I meet people face to face, they ask me, is what I'm experiencing burnout? So what I'm going to do today is just briefly talk you through what burnout is. We're going to talk about the WHO definition, and I'm going to talk about some of the physical, emotional and mental symptoms that you get with burnout as well. But to start, I think it's really helpful to talk about what burnout isn't. So I see a lot of people who come to me and they say, I'm absolutely exhausted, am I burnt out? Now, the thing about burnout is that exhaustion forms one part of the definition, but there are two other things that you need in order to meet the diagnostic criteria for it. So if you are just exhausted without ticking those other two boxes, then you don't, by definition, have burnout. However, emotional exhaustion, the fatigue of caring for too much for too long, is absolutely part of the definition. What I would say to you is, if you're thinking that you might be burnt out, does your exhaustion get better when you're away from work? Can you settle your exhaustion down by, for instance, having a nice weekend away or having some annual leave? Because if the answer is yes, then you're not burnt out, because unfortunately what happens is burnout is largely the symptoms start as being reactive to work, but then what happens is as you slide into burnout, they start to affect other areas of your life, and what you'll find is that by having some rest, that's not sufficient to get your symptoms to settle down. So let's talk a little bit about the definition of burnout. So burnout was first described back in the 70s by a psychologist called Freudenberger, but it wasn't until 2019 that the World Health Organization first recognized it. The definition that the WHO gives is that burnout is an occupational syndrome that occurs after a prolonged period of stress that has not been successfully managed. And there are three components to burnout. The first one is emotional exhaustion, so we've already touched on that. So that's the fatigue of caring for too much for too long. People with burnout are absolutely physically exhausted and mentally exhausted as well. The second component is depersonalization. So this is the depletion of empathy, caring and compassion. And it's this weird dichotomy that you get in burnout where you both care too much and care too little at the same time about your work and the pressure that it's putting on you. And the third component of burnout is a decreased sense of accomplishment and reduced professional efficacy. So what this means is that you're not performing as well at work and you're not doing as well as you had done previously, often accompanied by a sense of futility and that nothing that you do makes any difference. Let's start by talking about the physical symptoms of burnout before we move on to the psychological symptoms, because burnout is a really, really physical thing to go through, and it's really important not to underestimate the physical symptoms of burnout. So I'm going to list some physical symptoms that you might experience with burnout, but it's not a comprehensive list by any stretch of the imagination. So let's start from the top. So headaches, very, very common in burnout. Moving down to the chest, so palpitations, that's your heart racing in your chest, panic attacks, shortness of breath, chest pains, these can all be symptoms of burnout. Moving down to your tummy, so stomach pains and digestive problems are really common in burnout. Also, you quite often have a lot more muscle tension and muscle pain with burnout as well. Other physical things that you might notice in burnout, so increased minor illness, that's because your immune system is suppressed in burnout, poor sleep, disproportionate fatigue, high blood pressure, and changes to libido. So actually your libido can go both ways in burnout. Please note that this is not a comprehensive list of symptoms, and you might be experiencing some other physical symptoms that might be attributed to burnout. However, this is a good place to start. I think it's also really important to note that burnout doesn't just cause physical symptoms, it can also cause changes to your health and your long-term health as well. So what we see in burnout is increased cardiovascular risk in particular, increased accidents. There are a whole raft of other things that I'm not going to cover today because what I'm focusing on are the symptoms, but one of the take-homes actually really is that burnout changes your health long-term. If you are under the age of 45, for instance, then you have increased all-cause mortality, which, just blows my mind really that burnout can do that to you. So we've covered some of the physical symptoms of burnout. Now let's talk about some of the psychological symptoms. So that's the emotional and the the mental symptoms of burnout. And how I like to think about these symptoms of burnout is to categorize them into three things. There is some crossover and overlap between the symptoms, but I think it's helpful to think about it like this. So I like to think of them as mental health problems, emotional dysregulation, and cognitive changes. So mental health problems. What we see in burnout, interestingly, is that about 60% of people, this is what we see in the data, who have burnout also have a mental health problem such as anxiety, depression, or PTSD. Now, I think this is really interesting from a medical point of view, because what that means really is that 40% of people with burnout don't have a mental health problem alongside it. However, a lot of the symptoms of mental health problems such as anxiety and depression do cross over with the symptoms that you experience in burnout. So let's think about some of the symptoms you might get with anxiety. So you might get a lot of worrying, panic, rumination, intrusive thoughts. Those sorts of symptoms are very common in burnout as well as anxiety. When we think about depression, for instance, then what you might see in depression is low mood, apathy, social withdrawal, poor motivation, self-neglect. At worst, there might be thoughts of, deliberate self-harm or suicide, for instance. So you also get all of these symptoms potentially in burnout as well. So if you're not sure if you have a mental health problem or if you have burnout or if you have both, please speak to your doctor and get clarification from them. The emotional dysregulation that happens in burnout means that the people who have burnout in the data respond more disproportionately and with more emotional dysregulation to stresses that previously wouldn't have stressed them out in quite the same way. So what you might see is someone massively overreacting, or seeing yourself massively overreact to things that wouldn't normally stress you out. So quite often you see symptoms such as irritability, outbursts, anger. But you might also see things go the opposite way, and you might see cynicism, apathy, loss of enjoyment, that sort of thing. In terms of cognitive changes, so by cognition I mean how you think, basically. What you see is really significant changes in burnout. So quite often people with burnout have quite delayed decision making and decision fatigue. It takes them a lot longer to process things than it used to. People get very forgetful. They really struggle with their attention, their focus, and their concentration. And this then manifests itself at work with lack of productivity and poor performance. So I hope you can understand from what I've just talked through there that burnout, the definition is very clear about what it is and what it isn't, and you need to tick all three things in the definition in order to get the diagnosis. Plus, you also have to have been under a prolonged period of stress at work in order to receive that diagnosis as well. Burnout is not a mental health disorder per se, although personally I think that you could possibly classify it as a mental health disorder, but that's a topic for another time. And I've also just quickly recapped some of the physical symptoms that you get and also some of the psychological symptoms. And as you can see, there's a huge raft of symptoms that you can get in burnout. Now, what you see in burnout is that when people typically present in a crisis, so there will have been a slide into burnout where these symptoms might have started off as being at work and reactive to work stress, but then they start to affect that person outside of work as well. And then gradually they slide further and further into burnout because of significant changes that are happening to their brain and their body as a result of their burnout. It's not their fault. And then typically people present in a crisis. So hopefully that will have answered the question then. Am I burnt out? That's the definition, and those are some of the symptoms that you may or may not be experiencing. You don't have to tick every single symptom to get the diagnosis. I hope that's been helpful. If you have enjoyed what I've put out today, then please like and subscribe. You can find me at my website, www.beatburnout.co.uk. I'm at The Burnout Doctor on YouTube, and I'm at Dr. Claire Ashley on Instagram and TikTok. Take care.